to Faculty Scholar Day. This is Luke Morgan, and he will be presenting on online learning best practices and the Reformed Worldview integration. There will be about 5 minutes at the end for questions, so as you're listening, you can help engage the presenter by thinking of questions that you want to ask at the end.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you guys are all able to make it here today. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, particularly because this whole presentation is very applicable to our experience here at Kuiper College and what a dream of mine for this place would be. So, the topic I will be speaking about today is online learning, best practice and Reformed worldview integration. Whew, that's a mouthful. As my longtime friend and confidant, Winnie the Pooh, once said, it is more fun to talk with someone who doesn't use long, difficult words, but rather short, easy ones, like, what about lunch? But my interest in online learning began partially when I myself was considering online learning as a tool for continuing my own education. At the time, I was new in my job in admissions, and during the early fall months, it's difficult for me to commit to having one night a week to be on any campus, really. But to tell you the truth, I was a bit skeptical about using distance education for my own learning. It was more the thinking about the reality of my education taking several years, getting dragged out over several years, that made me say, okay, I'm willing to try something different, something new. So I'd scarcely begun my studies when I was invited to participate in a task force here at the college to explore distance education and to discuss some options related to how we might carry it out here. While I decided for myself that online learning would work for me, I didn't go into that discussion assuming that distance education could work at Kuiper College. So I think before getting into the how of online learning and Reformed integration, we need to answer 2 important questions. The first is pedagogical. Put simply, does online learning work? Or distance education, does it work? If we cannot satisfy ourselves that online learning can work, then it makes little sense to plan on how to do it. The second question is more philosophical. Does it fit with our mission? Ours being Kuiper College. And even if it could be proved that online learning can be effective, that's not the same thing as proving that it could be effective for us, or if we could or should use it as a pedagogical method. Only after we answer these 2 questions can we get to the point of wondering how we would go about it. In this presentation, I will explain how distance education is an effective means for teaching, how I believe it works with our mission at Kuiper College, and explain a curriculum I developed as the cumulative project for my Master's of Education program. Now, this curriculum is a program I developed for training faculty on how to do distance education best practice and integrating Reformed worldview specifically in arts and science curricula. This curriculum is a series of 6 lessons or modules, and the modules are built around 4 themes consistent with a healthy distance education program, which we will get into later. Now, to answer the first question, does distance education work? I realize that many of us have different views on what distance education is and varying perspectives on its effectiveness. You do not need to look far to find people who decry distance education as the death of good pedagogy. In his article, Mark Edmondson, a professor of English at the University of Virginia, says, and please pardon me, this is going to be a long quote, but I think it's important and relevant to our conversation. A few weeks ago, our president, Teresa A. Sullivan, was summarily dismissed and then summarily reinstated by the university's Board of Visitors. One reason for her dismissal was the perception that she was not moving forward fast enough on internet learning. Stanford was doing it, Harvard, Yale, MIT, but Virginia, it seemed, was lagging. But can online education ever be education of the very best sort? With every class we teach, we need to learn who the people in front of us are. We need to know where they are intellectually, where they are as a group, and what we can do to help them grow. Teaching, even when you have a group of 100 students on hand, is a matter of dialogue. A large lecture class can also create genuine intellectual community. Students will always be running across each other who are also enrolled, and they'll break the ice with a chat about it, and maybe they'll go on from there. Online education is a one-size-fits-all endeavor. The internet teacher, even one who responds to students via email, can never have the immediacy of contact that the teacher on the screen can, with his sensitivity to unspoken moods and enthusiasms. This is particularly true of online courses for which the lectures are already filmed and in the can. And we'll skip over the rest of that part, but Edmondson has three principal criticisms of online learning. And the first one is that he says education can't work and that it's not the best sort of education, it's really not customizable, and the community spirit experience is not quite as rich. So this is a perspective from a faculty member that doesn't think that online learning or distance education can work. And there's been a lot of research done from the student's perspective as well. And there are complaints that students make about distance education. Let's be upfront with those. Vicki Phillips, who was cited in 2009 by the U.S. News and World Report as the leading consumer advocate for online college students, and this has been over the last 20 years that she's had this role, says in her experience the top three complaints students have about online learning are missing or unengaged professors, poor customer service and advising, and group projects. Well, the third one I don't necessarily think is fair because I think that many students complain about that in an on-campus setting as well. But, okay, so those are the three. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here from both faculty and students. Now, does this convince me that online learning is not worth pursuing? Not a bit. I'd be happy to sit down with you in the dining hall over lunch to argue against Dr. Edmondson's scruples regarding online learning's lack of customizability and richest of community that can be fostered in an online community. But we don't have time to do that today, and they are more easily argued than his first point, and probably his strongest one, that online education is not the best sort of education. But I think when we want to look at education, what are we trying to say? I think the words of Abraham Kuyper are appropriate here. God's honor requires the human spirit to prove the entire complexity of what has been created in order to discover God's majesty and wisdom, and to express these in human thoughts with human language. Since the unbelieving world can do nothing but obscure God's majesty and wisdom, Christian thinkers are called to put their shoulders to that grand task that they alone can perform. What Dr. Kuyper says here is that as human beings, we cannot help ourselves from studying the created order because it is a part of our God-bearing image to resist not knowing, to shine a light on the unknown, and to systematically and clearly articulate the mighty power of God. If we imagine for a minute the world in its pre-fallen state and see in the eyes of our mind a world with no sin, we can imagine the university being a temple, a place of dazzling light, where the complex mysteries of our world and its underpinnings would be joyously and clearly studied, where the knowledge of God would flow like a river, and we as educators would sing the praises of God as we would communicate the wonderful truths we had uncovered to our students, impress in their hearts the glowing, burning desire to surpass us in their love for wisdom and fervor to learn all things knowable and possible as a tribute to the God who made us. So even now, in this world, in the throes of labor as the kingdom of God comes victoriously on, the Christian college, the university, remains one of the lights to the world, one of the great lights to the world, one of the most restorative spheres of sovereignty. We serve as a restorative force in the world and carry out our sacred commission that we call education. Now, this speaks to what education is. Now let's speak of what education tries to accomplish. If we understand that our goal is to be a temple to God where we learn to worship God with our minds, I think in a simplistic sense, we are trying to do two things. Develop competencies and facilitate personal growth. Let's start with the first, developing competencies. What do we mean when we say that? Well, put simply, we want our students to be able to do something. We want our accounting students to be able to settle invoices. We want youth ministry students to be able to organize an event. We want intercultural studies students to be able to integrate Reformed worldview and holistic missions. We want all of our students to be able to write a coherent paper, provide a cogent presentation. These are examples of things we want our students to do. Now here's where many people will interject and they'll say, yes, that we need our students not to just be able to do things, but we want them to know things. We want them to know what a neuron is. We want them to know how our government works. We want them to know what the Codex Sinaiticus is. And I agree, we do want these things. Here's where the paradigm shift comes in, and it's more subtle than we might think. What we are doing in this model of education is we're taking each of these bits of content or knowledge and we're putting the student to work with them. We are taking a piece of knowledge and creating a way of measuring it. So instead of saying, I want a student to know what a neuron is, I just rather say, I want a student to be able to explain to a partner what a neuron is. Or I want a student to be able to write a meaningful essay on the Congress that provides insight on how Reformed worldview should integrate with government. Or I want a student to be able to explain why the Codex Sinaiticus is important and how that strengthens her belief in the infallibility of Scripture. So as you can see, when we link measurable competency to each piece of knowledge we want students to have, the limitation of what we can teach through competencies is really only our imagination and the amount of topics knowable. The second area is a little more difficult to measure, but it's no less important: personal development. Now, this is an area that many of our minds is as important or even more important than the competencies alone. We want our students to grow. Because as Christian educators, one of the principal aims of this sphere of sovereignty is what I like to call person making. Does a college education from a place like Kuiper make you a more valuable person? No. But does a college education from Kuiper have the potential to make you a better person, a better thinker, with a developed mind that can contemplate God more deeply, consistently, and bear out man's highest calling? Can Kuiper help students to worship the Lord our God with all of our hearts, all of our souls, and with all of our minds? When we help a student to grow in each of these fields, we are accomplishing our mission as a college and serving faithfully within the sphere of authority commissioned by God. Now, there are a whole lot of things that fit in here. We want our students to grow in their faith and their awareness of their identity in Christ and a personal commitment to lifelong learning. We want our students to develop a biblical, reformed worldview to serve effectively Christ's church and his world. At a place like Kuiper, it might be easy to assume that a student will develop this way. But I suggest that is not something that we can assume, and we do so at the detriment of our students. I think this because the rest of the world, particularly in the area of higher education, is going in a very different direction. Higher education itself is very consciously going towards a different worldview, a different perspective. In her study on worldview development, Bryant, who's a secular scholar, she presented her paper at the Association for Higher Education, and she cited various scholars who helped her in her case for ecumenical worldview development in students. Now, in ecumenical worldview development, plurality is the goal for worldview development. And plurality really is a stepchild of relativism, in that while it allows for differences of opinions, it abhors one system's superiority to another. So while most of us here would agree that understanding another's worldview from their perspective is a useful tool, we would typically stop short of saying that all worldviews are created equal. Our mission statement names an ideal worldview, and though Bryant is right here in that we do live in a largely pluralistic society, we aim to bring all things under the sovereignty of Christ, not pluralism. The mission is the chief goal of personal development, to which we add the goals of lifelong learning, awareness of identity, etc. These two things stated that the principal aims of education are developing competencies in personal development. This new paradigm of learning suggests that education is a vehicle to these goals. In the past, and I believe currently, for many, the best way to achieve these goals was to have them come in regularly to a classroom, explain information to the students, and then assess that learning through projects and tests. Where we get into trouble is when we begin to value the mode of education over the goals, which are developing competencies and helping students personally grow. Let us not forget that what we hold as the dearest form of education, the Holy Scriptures, was in the first centuries a form of distance education. Paul longed to be joined with the church in Rome for several years, but God was content to have his inspired word pass through written communication at a distance. The Apostle John, when exiled on Patmos, likely thought he could have been put to better use, providing instruction in person. The Lord in his wisdom chose the written word at a distance as the mode of communication. The bonds of love were not diminished, nor the strength of the lessons that he was teaching. Granted, the aid of the Holy Spirit is an excellent aid in teaching our hearts, which I will not to presume to assume in a biology class. That said, if we believe that in our hearts that God has commissioned us to study his revealed world in each of the academic disciplines, and we have reason to believe that properly prepared people can learn at a distance, does it not follow that we may be called to use this means? In the beginning of the presentation, we asked the question, does education work? And I believe the answer to this question is yes. As the question is distance education helping to learn new competencies and develop personally? I believe it is. In a 2009 article in the New York Times, Steve Lohr explains a 93-page report submitted by the International Department of Education on a summary. Now, this is a summary of 99 studies that were done on distance education and online learning. It included thousands of participants and went throughout the lifespan. And what they found was that learners that have at least a portion of online learning throughout the curriculum, all the way up to completely online, actually did better on content-based assessments than people that learned exclusively in the classroom. So the research is done, the papers are in, the jury is in. 99 studies have been done, and they conclude that distance education can work. It can work. Now, while these studies claim that distance education, at least in some cases, can work as a means for education, that is not the same thing as saying that distance education could work here at Kuiper, or that it is necessarily congruent with our mission statement to equip our students with a biblical, reformed worldview to serve effectively Christ's church in his world. So let's talk about that aspect. First, I will explain why I think it's congruent with our mission and principle, and then I'll explain why I think it would serve our mission in practice. First of all, in principle, you read the first point there. Kuiper College actually has already offered distance education courses in the past, and the reasons for not continuing them were logistic, not because of perceived lack of missional fit. The second thing is Kuiper's mission has always been and continues to be global, to serve effectively Christ's church and his world. Distance learning allows us to increase our range outside of people within driving distance of our campus. At this time, based on our course offerings, we are set up to meet the needs of mostly local, traditional students, and we lack the tools to meet the needs of many non-traditional or non-local students for whom giving up a job or moving is not an option. And third thing, from a Kuiperian perspective, education exists under God's sovereignty as a sphere of creation that operates independently from other spheres. Over the centuries, methods of education have come and gone depending on the theory of education of the day. The current traditional model is certainly not the first model of education, and it's a means to an end. Abraham Kuiper said in his book on Common Grace, and I'm paraphrasing here, that for every podium that the public has to influence the world, there should be a corresponding and more convincing podium from the redeemed. Distance education is a podium that the world is using actively. And we, the Christian college, need to respond by taking what they are doing, claiming it for Christ, and beginning the process of making it better, more effective, and doing it to the glory of God. Now, beyond these 3 points, building distance education would be consistent with the strategic plan of the college. And you can read this for yourself, that it's built in the strategic plan that we should continue to invest in training and infrastructure to support distance education. So at various levels, this is something that would make sense for us. But beyond these points, let's talk about why distance education would be a good fit here philosophically. We mentioned that. Let's talk about practically now. Now, I don't think any of us would claim that distance education works for everybody. Each of us can imagine a student for whom online education would be a terrible decision. It takes additional drive, discipline, and commitment to be successful in the distance education environment. However, many colleges are still trying to use the model that works best for most 18-year-old freshman students. They're trying to use the same model for adult learners, for more mature students, transfer students, or for people who live at a distance. When we look at the data from the article I mentioned about the 99 studies, what we found is that traditionally aged students, which means 18 to 22-year-old full-time on-campus students, actually only make up 18% of the population utilizing higher education today. According to this study, 58% of current higher education pursuers are over the age of 22, and 40% are over the age of 25. If the argument is, how does an 18-year-old fresh out of high school student learn, Dr. Edmondson might have been onto something. But is that answer the same for a 37-year-old working mother of 3? The simple answer is the sort of education that we offer here at Kuiper is simply not on the table for a person like this one. Right now, there is not an online or distance education option for the non-traditional student, and so she can either study at a place that will meet her needs in terms of some of the competencies, but then we've lost the opportunity to introduce her to a reformed worldview and everything that comes with that. How about a pastor in Zambia who is ministering to several congregations? Is it really better for him to leave his family and congregations behind for 4 years to come and study on campus at a greater cost to donors than it would have been for him to do his program online? How many ministers could we equip for the same cost if distance education was a possibility? Beginning to offer online courses is a natural progression of the college's mission, goals, and would allow us to reach a broader audience to partner with in our mission of reformation. We know adults are looking for adult education because they are doing it. And based on the belief that God is calling as many adults into his service as the traditionally defined college student, it's our responsibility to find a way to meet that educational need where it exists. So up to this point, I've described why I think distance education works and why I think it's consistent with our message. There is a lot that goes into developing a distance education program, a lot of which I can't go into here. Here, I will identify 4 key themes I found in the literature that are consistently mentioned as crucial to a healthy distance education program. Though the titles for these categories varied, the concepts were much the same. And here we are titling these 4 themes for the healthy distance education program: faculty buy-in, course quality and student learning, faculty-student interactions, and administrative and technical support. Now let's talk about the first one, faculty buy-in. Before describing faculty buy-in, I want to be sensitive to the notion that buy-in might sound like an inappropriate term to use for getting faculty members on board with distance ed. I chose this term as it's the principal term used to describe this theme by most of the respected scholars in this area, and I think it's important for us to use the common language that scholars are using for there. Now, if we don't have faculty buy-in, distance education is a non-starter. If the faculty of any institution reject distance ed, it's the kiss of death to the concept. Possibly as deadly as outright rejection is the malignant cancer of apathy, which brings a slower but similarly gruesome end to our hopes. So what are some of the things that prevent buy-in? One thing would be a poorly articulated vision of what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to do it. If we reject the paradigm shift to active, experiential learning, then we will not see positive results even if we do have a good attitude, the results of which will discourage us further. Another significant obstacle to faculty buy-in is treating faculty improperly. Beyond the obvious problems with treating people inappropriately, problems with programs will develop as well. An example of this would be to not reduce a faculty member's load in concert with the new online responsibilities. If one is using only scraps of time to accommodate what is for many a new enterprise requiring new training, new skills, new students, and new tools for assessing student learning and growth, then the faculty member is much more likely to perform poorly, which will lead to poor course quality, unhappy students, and miserable faculty. Another obstacle to faculty buy-in is neglecting to provide technological support, particularly early on. Technology is a wonderful blessing, but for people like me, who gape in astonishment at the capabilities of computers, but writhe in fear when experiencing the wrath of a misbehaving one, I balk when confronted on the spot by a student, particularly if I don't have the tools that I need to help them. And the lack of support, or perceived lack of support, will make many faculty members shy away from online learning and may cause them to disparage the process altogether. So these are what we need to be sure what not to do. What's a good thing we can do? The first and probably most important thing might be to embrace feedback and input. While some growing pains are natural in any adjustment period, and we want to be sure to provide a can-do attitude, if we do not allow faculty a voice in shaping programs, voicing concerns, and identifying problems, or even more helpfully, suggesting solutions, we are handicapping the possibility of a healthy distance ed program. Now, the next one, course quality and student learning. In the paradigm of active experiential learning, course development is king. As distance educators, we can directly control much of student learning through how we write our courses, specifically through writing learning objectives and assignments that will help our students to learn. A crucial aspect of this is making sure that every assignment has an assessment tool connected to it. Since we are not there in person to see the light bulb go on in a student's eyes as she understands a new concept, we need to identify these light bulb moments through clear, consistent tools of assessment built into each learning assignment. Now, student learning is a piece of course quality, but not the only piece. Other pieces of course quality include clear expectations, clear communication, and prompt responses to requests for help or clarifications. Now, don't get me wrong, all right? I am of the firm opinion that good education should at times be stressful. I think it should be difficult. What I am saying is that a student's area of stress should be the stress that comes along with integrating a new idea into his consciousness, or battling with a difficult question that will bring him to a new level of understanding. Not fighting with the mechanisms of a course, or feeling lost with no one to guide him. That's not where the stress should be coming from. And this is why assessment is important, because not only in assignments, but also in regards to how smoothly the course is working, as that's probably as important of a piece of course quality. And of the 4 themes that I mentioned, this is probably the one that my curriculum spends the most time working with. Faculty-student interactions. As Dr. Edmondson pointed out, the relationship between a faculty member and her students, regardless of course size, is an important piece of quality learning. In a distance ed format, this is just as true. However, we manage these relationships differently. I can say from personal experience that it's quite possible to build a healthy faculty-student relationship in an online format. In my own program, my advisor was regularly available to meet with me over Skype or talk over the phone if we needed that, and sometimes a 5-minute conversation can get more accomplished in that than by sending emails back and forth for days on end. Now here's probably as good a time as any to dispel a common myth. If you are working with an online course, you are typically not expected to be available 24/7 over email. And many faculty members have taken the practice of writing into their syllabi that they will check their email, say, once or twice a day faithfully at the same time. And most of the reading says that it's better that you're consistent in the times that you check that rather than just trying to be available 24/7. Now, another important piece to faculty-student interaction is the use of boundaries, both on how students treat each other, how they respond to frustration, and what they expect from their faculty member. Just as we set up an expectation in the classroom on what behavior is acceptable, the faculty member needs to set up expectations for what behavior is acceptable in the online classroom and keep to those things. There is an entire module in this curriculum based on this concept. And as a couple of disgruntled students and a class discussion board can quickly degenerate, we need to make sure we have a caring, firm hand there. Now, managing the relationships between faculty and students, that would be essential to a Kuiper education. While a faceless educator might be acceptable at another institution, at Kuiper College, where we pride ourselves on our devoted affection for our students and personal connection to their stories, learning, and growth as believers, giving up on developing consistent, meaningful mentorship relationships is simply not on the table. Technical and administrative report. Now, this was mentioned in the context of faculty buy-in a little bit earlier, but it's important enough to mention as a theme for healthy distance ed. As the technical support aspect for this program would largely depend on what online provider the college would use, I forewent discussing this at length in the presentation and in the curriculum. But that would obviously be an important piece as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about best practices. So this curriculum that I developed has 6 modules or 6 lessons. And the themes were those 4 themes that we mentioned. We try to integrate those and be mindful of those in the lesson planning. So the curriculum, 6 modules. And as I mentioned, a 7th module probably would be necessary to add to this to talk about some of the technological things to go with it as well. Now, this first lesson is challenges and concerns of online learning. And this is the section most closely directed at working with faculty in hopes that they will choose to become partners in the distance education effort. This lesson tries to take an honest look at the challenges and shortcomings of distance ed and collaboratively imagining ways to overcome these obstacles. It provides a space for faculty members to voice their own concerns and insecurities. It provides a space for faculty members where they can help each other learn about the process. Now, this lesson is formatted in a way to provide examples for faculty members on how to teach and enforce knowledge retention through a popular model gleaned from Jane Vella, and this is known as learning tasks. Learning tasks are typically divided into 4 parts and follow a logical progression. Handily, they all begin with the letter I, which give them the name the 4 I's. The first I, induction, is where we give the students, or in this case, the faculty member, a question, prompt, or activity that gets their mind going on the topic that we'll be working with. We're laying the scaffolding groundwork for the learner by calling up something she already knows about the topic, and we build from there. So for example, in one assignment, the faculty member's first prompt is to write down on provided postcards 2 concerns that she has with online learning, and 2 ways that online learning might meet those needs better than an on-campus delivery. This task gets the person thinking, and since they are only invited to write down 2 items, she needs to prioritize them in her mind and write down the one that she thinks best. The second I is called input. Input is the stage where we confront our learners with a new idea. In one assignment, I provide Philip's top 5 concerns with online learning and invite the faculty members to try to guess what rank they are in. This is a more effective way of helping people to learn a new idea because they're working with the material. It's not just memorize these and then repeat them back to me. The third I, or implementation, is where we get the learners to take the idea and put it to work. So in the assignment I just mentioned, I invite the participants to begin crafting a strategy to combat a concern with online learning or mitigate its effect. This is experiential learning, putting new ideas to work. The fourth I, or integration, is our attempt to get the participants to retain the information. We do this by inviting them to develop a strategy for developing online community for their distance ed students through what they've learned. So these 4 I's, induction, input, implementation, and integration, are the model I use for their participants to carry out their teaching online. In every lesson throughout the rest of the curriculum, this is the method that I use, those 4 I's. Now, the second method, the second lesson, takes time to help faculty learn how to structure their learning, because this is a paradigm shift. We no longer have 60-minute lecture periods. So how are we going to take an idea that we want to communicate and make that clear to our students? The first step is through writing learning objectives. Now, a learning objective does 4 things. It explains who will be doing the learning. It explains, and you can actually see it if you look at the provided sort of lesson plan example. If you learn at the learning objective, you'll notice that there's probably 2 of them in there, and there's 4 different parts to it. The first part explains who is doing the learning. It explains what resources the students will need to do, what tasks they're going to have to do, and how we intend to measure that. So that is the nucleus for what we're going to use. We're going to say, okay, this is what we're going to teach, and then we carry that out through the 4 types of learning tasks. All right? Now, online best practice. That's the third one. And this gets into online experiential learning based off of Kolb's experiential learning and Bloom's taxonomy. Experiential learning, at its essence, is something that most good teachers do already. It's a way of teaching that encourages a student to interact with the material. This is what some professors are doing when they require a student to discuss a topic in small groups or summarize an article in their own words. Experiential learning is important because if a student reads material but doesn't interact with it, then his likelihood of retaining what he has learned is less than if he had interacted with it. Also, when we find a way to witness the student interacting with the material, we open up the possibility of measuring that interaction and providing feedback to help our students learn how to engage with new ideas. Now, we talked a little bit about the experiential learning. Let's talk about Bloom's taxonomy now. Some of you may have heard about Bloom's taxonomy before, maybe in a development class or education class. Bloom's taxonomy is essentially saying that not all levels of learning are created equally. It says that some of the levels, like memorization or summarizing, don't require the same level of knowledge as the higher levels, which, depending on the version of the taxonomy you're looking at, usually have some level of assimilating a new idea or creating a new product of your own based on the things that you've studied. Now, the key to the kingdom when it comes to writing lessons that use high levels on Bloom's taxonomy is the verbs that you choose when you're writing your learning objectives and learning assignments. If the words you're saying is, read this and prepare for a quiz, the behavior you're encouraging is memorization. If, however, the verbs that you're using are using these materials, create an idea or a strategy or make something with this, that's using a whole nother level of reasoning than the simple memorization or summarizing in your own words kind of learning. And the verbs that we're using will either provide a ladder for our students to take their learning to whatever level they're capable of, or if we are satisfied with them memorizing or whatever, then there's no reason that they won't be satisfied as well. So we can, in essence, be creating a ceiling for our students' learning by the verbs that we choose when we write our learning objectives. Okay? So the next section, difficult or dishonest students. And this is honestly a lesson that isn't very much fun, because this is a lesson that talks about the reality that we live in a fallen world. Some students can sometimes be tempted to intellectual dishonesty. Sometimes the discussion boards, if we don't set up good boundaries, people can be abusive to each other in a written format. And so this is an important skill that we need to learn. But once again, is one of the things that we wish we didn't have to do. But the good news is that there are proactive steps a faculty member can do in an online format to make these things less likely to happen. By setting up clear expectations of what's acceptable and enforcing that when they see the need. So that's the difficult, dishonest students. Now, here's the part that I really get excited about. The Reformed worldview, baby. This is the section that kind of goes by way of review over Reformed worldview, and it begins to bridge the gap of integration into the course material. So this lesson covers some basic tenets of Reformed worldview. And so, for example, in a modern art history class, this is something I want to be very clear about. We're not going to cut material out of a class to make room for Reformed worldview. So if we were going to take an art history class, we wouldn't cut out some things for it. We would instead incorporate the worldview component into the content. Now, this is an important skill to learn because as good reformers, we believe that a course on art offered at a Christian college should be as good or better in terms of the expectations we have for our students and in regard to academic rigor. And we do not need to cut down the content lest we give credence to the suspicion that Christian education is any way inferior to a public education. Another aspect unique to this curriculum is the close attention paid to being intentional about how our students go about developing worldview. If you flip to your handout in the part that's got it's got two pyramids looking in there, this is something I'm exceptionally passionate about. So I created the active and passive models, which you can see as pyramids in your packet. In the passive model, the assumption is that individuals, whether Christian or not, cannot be separated from their immediate context. That experience and culture provide the basis from which individuals develop a worldview. From this passively developed worldview comes practice or behavior. Now, this model is not incorrect so much as it's undesirable. I would argue that most people develop their worldview this way. But the model I'm advocating for is a model that places the Bible, Scripture, and theology as the basis for developing a worldview, from which we shape our culture and interpret our experiences. Now, some might argue that it's impossible to separate ourselves from a culture when interpreting Scripture, and perhaps this is so. But I would argue that by broadening our students' range of experiences, by introducing them to a range of writers from a broad spectrum of times and cultures, it becomes possible to be conscious of one's biases. It becomes possible to be critical of faults and weaknesses within oneself and one's culture. It becomes possible to actively build your worldview rather than be built by it. Now, the last section is where we invite the faculty member or professor to take the mission statement of the college and use this as a last way to cement the sort of buy-in, to sort of energize us with what we're trying to accomplish. Because I really believe that if we don't set up our motivation in the beginning, sometimes it can be hard to follow through with things. And so this last section would be an opportunity for the faculty members to work through some of the things together, how we go through integrating the mission statement in online education. So we've covered a lot of material. We began by arguing that distance education can and does work, and that it would be a terrific continuation of our mission here at the college. I explained some of the pitfalls that have been discovered by those who went before us, such as treating faculty improperly or providing inadequate technological support. We discussed the 4 themes for a successful distance ed program: in faculty buy-in, course quality, faculty-student interaction, and technological support. And then from there, we explained how a curriculum designed with these themes in mind would be an experiential one that would take careful planning through writing learning objectives that would be carried out through learning tasks and would require students to learn experientially at the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy with frequent assessment. Moreover, we learned that we do these things intentionally to develop students who are competent, personally developed, eager, and equipped to bring God's grace into today's culture. Now, our time draws to a close, but our responsibility to develop a way to extend the reach of Kuiper's education is close to my heart, and I hope it's growing closer to yours too. In terms of the curriculum here, I have any level of depth that you would like to see if you wanted me to send you things about that. I've got curriculum, a database of 100 resources, video, interactive, all different kinds of things. I mean, any level of interaction you want to have following up on this, I'm happy to begin that dialogue with you, but that's the end of my formal presentation. So now, there's time for questions. Yes, sir.